I'm Kashish, co-founder and co-CEO of Hightouch. Excited to share with you a presentation about data apps. And the caveat I want to give everyone here is that I'm by no means the expert on data apps. So would love to get questions from the crowd on like what you guys kind of think data apps are. We're here with a proposal. We just want to kind of discuss like this is what we propose a data app is, and then get ideally the community during the office hours an hour from now to really talk about how they're using data apps at their companies and at their products. And really, like a lot of the presentation is going to be sharing about how other companies in the space are implementing data apps and what vendors exist right now in the data app space. So just really sparking ideas. I think we're really nascent in the field of data apps today, and where we could be in 5 years is way, way more exciting than today. So super excited to share, and welcome to the talk on data apps. Oh, I have a clicker. Oh, cool. Sorry. All right, nice. All right, yeah, I'm Kashish, co-founder and co-CEO. We started Hightouch about 1.5 years ago, and we're the reverse ETL kind of like leader in the space. We get data from any data warehouse into any SaaS tool. So most commonly, you might have something like Trino, Databricks, Snowflake, BigQuery, and you want to get that BigQuery data into your Salesforce or your HubSpot, and that's really what we do. And all you need to make the product work is a SQL query or a DBT model. So given that, no code, we'll just get that data into your CRM and power any sort of product or marketing workflows that you have. So yeah, getting right to it, what is a data app? We're defining a data app as any app built on your data warehouse instead of a transactional database. And what that means is the primary data store or the persistent layer of the application is your data warehouse. And so usually you'd have like Snowflake as the place where you're storing all of that data, or name any data warehouse here instead of Snowflake. And the idea is that can we use Snowflake as the persistent data store for applications that we build? So let's say we're building a CRM or a help desk or an order management system. Can we actually build it on top of Snowflake? Because guess what? We already have Snowflake in our companies, and that means it's really easy to spin up. The data's already there. We can bring our own schema and build some sort of UI and like user interface on top of it to make it all work for our business users. And maybe even external of our company for our end users that are purchasing our product. And so as there's a really good primer on this, and it kind of discusses how data apps are the future, because the whole idea is that we already own this data store and we have full control over it. So instead of having to transform my data into users and objects accepted by Salesforce or some other tool, I actually get to say, accept my schema as it is and just build an application on top of it. And me as a data user or someone on the data team can ideally spin up these data apps without any new like front-end development work. So the ideal would be that you simply define SQL queries or different ways to like interact with the operational database, or in this case, the analytical database, and draw data from that database as needed. So why is it so simple? Like, it's because of the ability to use your single source of truth in your company. So this data warehouse already exists and already has the data in it. So instead of creating replicas of the data warehouse into different transactional databases, you simply just use the original. And that means you're not maintaining all these different replicas as silos that might diverge from the original. And so you get complete consistency in your data, which is like just a very, very nice thing to have in a company. That lets you greatly speed up your development. So instead of, again, setting up a Postgres to make your applications work for your internal tools, you ideally would just run right on top of Snowflake, potentially even deploy on top of Snowflake. So that's like a promise of Snowpark that has not fully materialized yet, but we're very excited about, because in theory, you can host your code on Snowflake as well and host your entire UI on Snowflake. And then like what's more interesting to us is really like the data team has control over this. And so instead of relying on product engineers and people to write API calls for everything, more and more can be based on the actual data warehouse to store that business logic. So you could say that a transformation is actually how we transform like total amount spent, rather than like having an API that counts how many transactions a user has made. And so like a lot of people ask, should I be building data apps at my company? And my answer is usually, actually, you probably already have data apps. Like any consumer of the warehouse actually is probably building some sort of data app, but we're just not calling it that yet because it's not like a full-fledged product necessarily that someone else in your company is using. But you probably already have those. I wouldn't say that it's something that everyone needs to build tomorrow. It's much more like, if I have a good use case for it, then I might want to build one. So for example, if I want to do some sort of like enrichment, where enriching actually makes way more sense to do through the data warehouse rather than through some API, that's when you might want to build a data app. as an enrichment layer on top of the data warehouse. And of course, there's many prerequisites to making this work. So it means that you have a data warehouse, ETL, some clean data and transform data in the data warehouse. And it usually means that like, your data team actually has a lot of context on the business and what they want to do with that data. So most people here, I think, are already in that mature data stack or like a mature data journey. But if not, then there's many prerequisites for being able to set that up. And so as I kind of mentioned, like, the consistency is the biggest pro. You'd never get diverging data if your data is always based on one data store like your warehouse. And like, it works really well with a modern data stack. So assuming you already have something like DBT models, it would be very easy for you to create a new model, to create a new materialized table that then any consumer of that data app can use as like an actual UI within the application. So I might have some user database, and I want to provide my customer success team a UI to see all orders made by specific users. And so through a data app, they could easily click on a user's email address and then see all orders. And you as the data team would simply have to materialize a table for give me all user orders sorted by their user IDs. And so that's the kind of thing where it's like the business logic can actually be stored in the warehouse in the format of transformations rather than API calls on different tables that are like just creating joins every single time. The cons, on the other hand, are actually pretty plentiful, which is why data apps don't really exist in practice too often today. And so like the number one and number two reasons are in an analytics database like a Snowflake or BigQuery, you usually can't do transactions. This is no longer true. Snowflake actually does support transactions now, but for all intents and purposes, warehouses don't support transactions. And so if you're doing like two different operations, you can't necessarily maintain that both operations finish every single time and not just one. So like a good example of this is, let's say I'm transferring money from one bank account to another bank account. I would want to make sure to subtract $100 from one account and then add $100 to another account. And if only one of those two operations succeeds and the other one doesn't, then now someone has too much money or someone has too little money and there's like something wrong. So transactions in that format, like you simply like cannot enforce in most data warehouses. Snowflake now does support this, so they're quickly working on building the infrastructure that makes data apps practical. And that's again why like Snowflake is a pretty exciting partner to work with. Performance, for obvious reasons, warehouse queries oftentimes run slower than transactional DBs. You can't do constraints. So if you wanted to do like a foreign key on another table, you actually can't enforce that foreign key. You also can enforce things like cascading deletes. And so that can cause divergence as well in a transactional world. And you can't search by IDs. So in the example I gave you where I said, show me all orders by some user ID, I wouldn't be able to query the warehouse every single time. It's to say like, give me user ID, Kashish at Hightouch.io, give me all orders. Because that would get really expensive. Snowflake would scan all users every single time and then charge you like dollars probably per time you're asking for each user. So it would be impractical from a cost perspective and a speed perspective. But with a caching layer, it is possible. So that's what I get to a little bit later. So again, data warehouse is the primary store of data. And the interesting thing that a lot of data apps do today is they actually have a caching layer. So what you'll say is that give me my data warehouse, replicate little parts of it into a caching layer, and then let me make a production application on top of that caching layer. And that way, I can get the benefits of a transactional DB where it runs pretty fast, and I can do reads with good speed and lookups with good speed. But I don't have to worry about having a replica that diverges from the data warehouse. So I still say, like, I would still call this based on the data warehouse. Like, sure, the data warehouse is not the only persistent data store. There is a cache in between. But as long as that cache is like a carbon one-to-one replica of the data warehouse, then I think for all intents and purposes, we should unconstrain it and say that data apps should allow caching layers in between. And so that is actually how like companies like Hex, Preset, a lot of other companies that we consider data apps get by with faster read times and still have a very consistent flow from the data warehouse. And oftentimes what they'll do is they'll say, let me update this cache on some schedule, like every 45 minutes. I want to make sure that anything that was changed in the warehouse then materializes back into my application. Where the server sits that serves the UI in the front end actually doesn't matter. It could be on the warehouse, it could be off of the warehouse, it could be in your own like on-prem, it doesn't really matter. Because what we really care about is the persistence data store being the data warehouse. And then there's this kind of like debate about whether a data app has to have write ability to the warehouse or whether it's read-only or whether it's both. And it actually exposes a pretty big flaw in data apps, which is, let's say I want to do writes. Those writes might take an hour or longer to materialize, and then other users of the data app to see that exact result, right? So like, again, let's go back to that orders example. Let's say I refund an order or I place another order, how long is it until my data app UI actually sees the results of that new order? And then another example is, let's say me as a user of the data app, I can go and click like refund user. I can click something like give this user a free paid plan for 3 months. Other users of the data app may not see the results of that for like another hour or two, because they may have to require a lot of different models to materialize, test cases to pass, then it's written to the warehouse, then we read from the warehouse to our cache, and then we see it. So writes are actually like a big fundamental flaw right now for data apps. And that's actually where we think like a lot of improvement can be made in terms of being able to create like basically like production layers on top of data warehouses that can be used for both reads and writes and then replicate back. So like oftentimes what you might see is someone might actually create a table specific to their data app and then use that table and always replicate it back to the warehouse. So it almost needs to be bidirectional in that way. And I think that's a big gap right now on data apps that we would love, again, for the audience to like kind of shed some light on into like how they think writes can be possible. And then open questions that we have is, how do we reconcile like the fact that like updates need to be fast enough to reflect in the UI? So like most end users are used to something like 100 millisecond latency for them to click a button and then see an action happen. In a data app world, that may not be possible. So you may have a user, again, like place an order and you may not see that order for an hour. And for an Amazon.com customer support rep, that doesn't work. They need to be able to see that order instantaneously in case someone is filing a support ticket right afterwards. So things like order management, customer support, there's a lot of use cases that actually are not well supported by data apps today. And like later on, I make a case for why aggregations and like general like kind of data on like multiple users is actually a much more common application for data apps. And then the next is like, which warehouses do we use to build these? Is it like any warehouse? Is it specifically warehouses that are meant for faster reads? Is it only stuff like ClickHouse that's like truly like almost transactional in nature? And that's still open-ended. We can't say that we've built data apps outside of the perspective of Hightouch. So we would love to, again, like get ideas from the audience there. And yeah, I'll skip over this slide because it's really just making a case for why data apps are becoming interesting or popular. It's because warehouses have gotten so much faster and because of the separation of storage and compute. Because now you can simply say, hey, I can run this query instead of in 5 hours, I can run it in 5 minutes, which means that it would be practical to make an application on top of this. And maybe now I do feel comfortable spending the money to replicate this data every hour because all of the operations are not going to cost me like a team of 10 data engineers to maintain my Hadoop cluster for me. So that kind of accessibility difference is making a big difference. And then shout out to companies like Materialize, Firebolt, and ClickHouse for really, really going cutting edge on how fast a warehouse can be and helping like people like us think about data warehouses almost as transactional in nature. Materialize is doing something definitely interesting, which is incremental materialized views. And so that actually does solve for what I was describing, where if I write something back, will I have to materialize the entire table every single time? Or can I just incrementally materialize the parts that are relevant to this new data? And with Materialize's framework, it actually can. So Materialize is here. Definitely take a look at their booth and like talk to them if you're interested in this incremental materialization. It's super interesting in the way that they do it. All right, cool. So now for the interesting part. There are actually a lot of people that are considered data apps today. And this is a little bit of a roadmap of the current vendors that we kind of recognize as data apps. Again, this was written in the blog post that I linked on the first slide. And so we got like finance tools, CRMs, product tools, and security. And again, the fundamental nature of all of these tools is that they're built as warehouse native. It's like warehouse native is popping up as a term that people are liking to use around like, oh, my app is based on the warehouse. And therefore, I'm never going to store your customer data or your data at all in my database. It's going to be always in your warehouse, and I'm just going to build on top of your warehouse. So Streamlit is kind of like the hallmark standard for like what helps us build data apps. It's kind of interesting because like Snowflake just bought Streamlit, and it shows Snowflake's commitment to helping people build applications on top of Snowflake. Streamlit is a bit different though because it primarily helps people with BI use cases as far as I've seen. And again, I would love to see like cases where that's like, there's like other use cases too. But primarily, it helps you build UIs on top of your existing Snowflake data. And it's pretty elegant. Like you simply like couple lines of Python, and now you get your Snowflake DB as a DB that you can use to build applications on top of. And then the rest you can write in Python, and you get like a nice Django app if you want. So it's super nice in terms of being data engineer friendly, but interested to see like what people actually do with it in terms of like helping end consumers or end business users actually like use data warehouse for like new applications. Hex is another company that we've seen do really well. They've raised a Series B that they announced yesterday, and they're building data science notebooks on top of the data warehouse. And again, this is super fun for us to use because like we're an internal user of Hex because really like given the warehouse, you can run both code and SQL on top of the warehouse to be able to run any sort of analysis that you want. And instead of rerunning all of the past queries every single time, they'll be able to run just the parts of the computation that are relevant to changes that you make. So they have like pretty elegant like ways to optimize how much you compute on the data warehouse. But fundamentally for the end users, what's interesting is I now get access to the data warehouse as if it's like my local machine, and I can write computation or code or queries on it pretty simply. So just really easy for like brainstorming new equations or like new data science models. Preset is actually like the cloud version of Apache Superset. And so originally it was primarily a BI tool, but where it gets really interesting from a data apps perspective is to use Preset for embedded analytics, which is really the direction that they're trying to go into. So I'm Hightouch. I have all these users, and they use my app, and they want to see the data about how many data points they're syncing or how many times they're running into errors, and basically get analytics on their Hightouch data. So Preset could actually generate a dashboard, an individual dashboard for every single one of Hightouch's users, and say, here's how many data points you've synced, how many failures, how many matches, etc. And they could let me embed analytics into my app, where the Hightouch engineers don't have to write any front-end code, and they can simply provide a query, and Preset can insert different users into that query and, as a template and say, all right, show me the dashboard for this customer versus that customer. So embedded analytics, I think, is like something that gets pretty exciting. Xflow is also in this space. And I think that it's just going to streamline how much data teams can actually build product that end users see, rather than data teams most of the time building kind of like internal dashboards. Retool, I think in the past we would not have called a data app, but recently has been becoming one. Because you can basically build anything you want in Retool and read from the warehouse. So sure, there's no write layer. If you want to write anything back, you have to write a REST API in the Retool world. But you can build CRMs out of Retool. You can build like customer support out of Retool, really like anything on top of the data warehouse. And it will let you write JavaScript or SQL on top of like basically like anything. So it's infinitely extensible, which means it kind of does everything and nothing at the same time. But we use Retool internally. We've used it for like 4 years. And like, if you have any internal tools you need to build, and you have a Snowflake or a Postgres already working, Retool can probably do that for you in like 10 minutes. So that's exciting from a data apps world. I call this more like a Streamlit in some ways because it kind of does anything, and it leaves to the user to imagine what they want to do. This is probably the most contentious one. Do we count BI as a data app? And I don't know the answer to this question because in some ways, Looker doesn't have any data store. It just pulls from your data warehouse, and it does build you dashboards that business users can look at, and they can do filters on to see like important information. And then if they want to use that information, they download a CSV, and then they can upload that CSV for some purpose, right? So BI, by our loose definition, could be a data app, and so you could count Looker, Mode, et cetera, as data apps. But we've had these for a very long time, so maybe that means data apps are not really anything new, but the speed of access is just increasing. PGCRMs are like basically the new age Salesforce. And these are tools we're pretty excited about. So like, just for anyone that doesn't know what PGCRM is, it's a product-led growth CRM. And that basically helps you as a company with a lot of product users come in and say, hey, well, I have all these users. Can you help me identify which ones are likely to buy or likely to convert or having trouble in my app and getting into all these errors, and I need to reach out to them. So PQLs, MQLs, and SQLs, they help you identify those and then get a sales rep in front of using those. So the interesting thing here is that in order to do this, they ETL your warehouse into a Postgres, and then from that Postgres, they run the Pocus app. And then there's a few more of these. Endgame correlated variants are all different PGCRMs, and they're all tackling it in a bit of a different way. But the reason I mentioned Pocus here is because Pocus is warehouse native, whereas the other ones are oftentimes using segment data or like other data like from Salesforce. Pocus is based on the warehouse. So I think it's a little bit better for like more enterprise or like mid-market companies that have a data warehouse. And where it gets interesting is that your sales users or sales ops users can actually define a PQL or a metric without having to go to their data team every single time. So this is both scary and like interesting because you may not want that like sales users to define their own PQL score. You may want to own that PQL score, in which case you probably don't want to use this PGCRM for everything. You want to write that into the warehouse and let the PGCRM pull from the warehouse. But if you are a user that wants those sales users to have complete control over what is a PQL, And I'm realizing that actually 2 logins is enough for a PQL. I don't need 4 logins. They can just go and change that in 2 seconds, and boom, now they have more PQLs. That is actually exactly why you'd want to use something like Focus. And it is a little bit black boxy in the analytical way, but it's really useful in the business user way. Indicative, recently purchased by mParticle. mParticle is here too, so I think they would love to talk to you about them, is basically like Amplitude on the warehouse. And it's truly warehouse native as well, where like instead of having to send all your data to Amplitude, Amplitude stores it for you, and then you get a nice dashboard and analytics out of it. Indicative, simply plug and play into your warehouse, bring your own schema, and it will work for both events data and object data. So super interesting from a product's analytics perspective. And that's kind of like a good articulation of the dream, right? Imagine if like no longer do I have to collect events on my website and store them all in like Amplitude as well as Segment as well as like all these other places. And I can always just forward them all to the warehouse. And I can expect that as long as I get everything in the warehouse, I've done my job. And product teams will use Indicative to get their analytics. Marketing teams will use something else. Sales teams will use Focus. All these other teams will just consume the warehouse data in some other way. And my only job is to get in the warehouse. That's kind of like the promise of data apps, which gets really interesting from data teams' perspectives. And then we got Panther. Panther is like security on the data warehouse, and it also works kind of out of the box. And would be interested to see like who's like using Panther too, because we actually don't know as much about this application, but we kind of see it as best in class for security that is controlled from the data warehouse data. Epo is a newer tool for A/B testing. And A/B testing is interesting because it's very similar to feature stores, but just a little bit different. And so the idea here is that you could actually write which test class a user is in into your warehouse, and then Epo would serve that for you, and then get that data for you, write it back to the warehouse for you, and then be able to basically use your warehouse as your optimizely, or as your layer, or as your launch darkly, for being able to do A/B tests. And that's actually like kind of makes a lot of sense. Like there's not really a reason why you want to send all your like A/B tests to Launch Darkly, have Launch Darkly run them for you, and then tell you the analytics there. Like if you have a warehouse already, it's pretty easy to compute that data into like A and B in your warehouse and simply run it from there. So again, it's like every single one of these data apps that we see them skipping like a layer of development. So the data that I have to then ETL into like Launch Darkly and then maintain there, I get to skip that step and just do everything in the warehouse. So that's like really just an expression of velocity that we can just move faster with data apps. And then these are like notebooks or like documents on BI. So some of them are pretty cool in terms of their UX because you can write both text, SQL, or code, and it'll turn that into different dashboards. And so it's almost like LaTeX or Markdown, where I'll just write everything in Markdown, and then in there I'll add some SQL queries or some dashboards. And every time it computes, it'll compute with the most recent metrics. And so imagine instead of making a board deck, as a data team, you can just make a dashboard and it updates every single time. So by the time they open that board deck, 2 days from now or 4 days from now, it has the newest data because it's always just pulling in from the data warehouse. So also like Notion could be replaced in theory by something like this, where it has live data updates. Cool, and then where we get excited is like what is not being done already. So vendors are helping us use the data warehouse in new ways. And it's a good starting point. But internally in our own companies, we could actually build data apps that are significantly more interesting. So imagine if like we were to build a CRM on top of the data warehouse and no longer needed Salesforce because we have all our data here. We simply just need to build like UIs for salespeople to tag, I own this deal or I don't own this deal, and then be able to reach out, forward emails, etc. That's actually kind of what Retool does in some ways, and people do use Retool as a CRM. I think there's probably in the very near future going to be some vendor, even outside of PLG CRMs, that's going to build an abstracted CRM on the data warehouse. And so if anyone's looking for a startup idea, I think that's a pretty solid one where why don't we build an abstracted CRM that follows any data model? So instead of just requiring contacts and leads, I can have anything I want and I can do different actions or the same actions on those different objects. That gets pretty interesting. There's a new tool called Supergrain. Supergrain is actually building kind of like the Braze or Iterable on top of the data warehouse as the data warehouse native app. And so it's basically an ESP, just in the traditional sense, all the prescribed UIs. But instead of having to send the ESP all your data, it just plugs and plays in the warehouse. So I think Supergrain is probably going to be an up-and-coming player in the space too. Then the metrics layer in some ways is kind of like a data app. If you use it like properly to actually like enforce like other things downstream. So everyone probably knows here, like the metrics layer is where you would define aggregations or like different metrics, something like a churn score or propensity to buy score, even something as simple as total purchases over time. And in that metrics layer, because you've defined those values, then other data apps or other tools can pull those values and say, all right, I know there's no column for like total purchases or propensity to buy, but this metrics layer has shown me how to access it. And so I'll just query the metrics layer, which will query the warehouse and always give me the right data and the right metric. And helps me have like one revenue metric rather than 17 revenue metrics in my company. So the metrics layer kind of enables data apps, and at the same time is also in the same time. And where I get pretty interested is like thinking of like building feature stores or like any sort of place where like you could serve ML models or serve like feature flags off of the data warehouse. And so in the original world, right, we would have a Snowflake or some data warehouse. We would ETL that into Postgres, or some product team would use that Postgres or use a LaunchDarkly. And from that LaunchDarkly to Postgres, you'd serve your feature flags. So I would say, okay, you're my user that has access to the enterprise plan, so you get like 4 destinations, and then you only have 1 destination. And that's the difference between both of these 2 users. And I'm going to serve that feature flag off of this LaunchDarkly or this Postgres. In theory, there's no, like, I don't want to like ruffle too many feathers, but there's no real need for LaunchDarkly in the data warehouse world. Because in theory, all your feature flags could be like written into LaunchDarkly. And the only thing you actually need is for your production app to be able to call an API and be able to ask, all right, what feature flags does this user have? And so that's where the data app comes in, where it can say, all right, I'll store your data warehouse table in a faster database, like a memSQL, and I'll update it every hour. And that way your feature flags are up to date every hour. And now I'll use this memSQL to power my production application. And that will have really solid latency to let me serve the feature flags instantaneously. But as a result, now your data team owns the feature flags instead of your product team. And they can determine which users are able to get which feature or which ones don't. And so that's where it gets really interesting, because then you can just reduce the middleman. There's not really a good reason to pay LaunchDarkly if you have like a Postgres in your company that you can just use for this purpose. And I think that's another big space for like a company to exist, which is really being able to build good feature flags or good like feature stores off the data warehouse. DataRobot's kind of in the space. Epo, which I mentioned, is kind of in the space, but no one's really doing it as a infrastructure play. It's kind of like very verticalized right now. Yeah, so why does Hightouch care about data apps? So loosely, we have like a data app within Hightouch called Hightouch Audiences. So as you guys know, reverse ETL is use a SQL query to get data replicated from the data warehouse into other applications like Salesforce. Hightouch Audiences is actually very different. So Hightouch Audiences takes something like the schema defined by a metrics layer and says, because you gave me these metrics, I can actually give you a point-and-click UI where people can define user subsets or user audiences. And it works for kind of like any user in plain English. So instead of having to say, all right, give me users joined on orders based on this ID, and then now I have users, all orders by all users, it simply just says, like, all right, give me users that placed an order in the last 30 days. And then it'll show you those. And you might be able to say, all right, what's the SKU for those orders? And show me all users that ordered something purple. So by the related object, which is an order, which has a related object, which is item, I can query all users that had purple orders of items that were purple in color. And now I can create a Facebook audience out of that. And I can even enumerate that. I can say, give me all colors of the rainbow. So it's like Roy G. Biv. Give me a user audience that ordered items of each of these colors, and upload 7 Facebook audiences to Facebook that express users that ordered purple, users that ordered yellow, orange, and so on. And that way I can market new purple products to people that bought purple and so on. So it's like a bad example of like where you kind of open up the data warehouse floodgates to users that might need to access that data to run campaigns. And that was just the ads use case. You might want to show them TikTok ads. You might want to show them emails, push notifications, text messages, pretty much anything that a marketing team might want to do. You can power using Hightouch Audiences. And the reason we call this a data app still is because there's actually no caching layer in between. It really does simply take your metrics layer, take this point-and-click UI where you define, like, all right, users that put object in cart but did not buy, and then lets you compile that into SQL and runs that SQL in the warehouse every single time. So each time that audience computes, it'll ask the warehouse, all right, show me all the users that did this, and then it'll send that over to some SaaS tool. And it's almost like you could call each of the different use cases, like a Facebook ads use case as like one data app, and then like maybe like an Amplitude use case, a different data app. or like maybe there's a Salesforce task use case, and that's another data app. So it's almost like more of a framework to help you build data apps in your company by exposing business users that have these campaign ideas to be able to build their own. And that's what gets exciting for us. There's this new product that we're launching in a few weeks called Hightouch Traits, which lets people kind of like define their own traits on users. So again, like I might want to say like a user that logs in like more than 5 times is a high value user or a high propensity to use user. And so I can just define that trait in Hightouch Audiences and use that column for many different things. And like in another audience, I can ask for that trait, which is number of logins, as an aggregation. And traits actually links one-to-one with the DBT metrics layer and asks like, all right, if you have the DBT metrics layer, we'll simply just take all your traits from there. And if you don't have that, then we can help you create those. But it kind of like mixed bag for the more sophisticated companies using DBT. You kind of get it to work out of the box, which is really nice. And lastly, there's this concept of like creating a notification stream off the warehouse that gets pretty interesting. So like, let's say you have a user that signs up. Can you get a Slack feed of all users that sign up? Or can we make it even more interesting? So user workspaces that grow past 10 users, maybe we should get a Slack feed of that goes to our account executives telling them, hey, all accounts with more than 10 users should be on the business plan. And so here's a feed of all accounts that upgraded to 10 users. Go sign them up for the business plan. So that kind of notification feed off of the warehouse is actually something users have been doing with Hightouch for the past like year and a half, ever since we started as a company. And it doesn't fit well into the constraints of reverse ETL. Because when you think of reverse ETL, you think of copying the users table to another users table somewhere else. But creating a notification feed out of Slack is much more like a data app. It's much more like, all right, I have this database or this data warehouse, and what can I do out of it to like empower different use cases? And in this case, it's the PQL use case of getting people that are product qualified in front of a human being at my company so I can go reach out to them from a sales perspective. So that's where it gets really interesting and fun for our users. We didn't think of these use cases. Our customers kind of came to us and said, hey, what if I could get my warehouse data into Slack? And then our engineers were like, yeah, sure, we can do that. And we developed completely new frameworks for doing this, which is like the reverse ETL framework is object to object. Then there's a notifications framework. And we even have like an events-based framework, which is like event forwarding almost from your data warehouse. So love to talk to you guys about all this kind of stuff like in our office hours, because it does get more complex, but then way more interesting because you're not creating new replicas. You're actually creating use cases directly off the warehouse. And then there's ecosystem enablers like Streamlit and Snowpark that are really making like data apps more accessible to us. So like I don't even have to host my own data app anymore if I want. I can just use Streamlit to host it for me. And that gets pretty exciting because otherwise you have to spin up AWS and host your data app there and watch it and make sure it doesn't break. So that's super nice. And then Snowpark, theoretically at some point will allow you to host code on the Snowflake server itself and like have the UI hosted there. So I'm excited to see how that plays out because I think again that'll just make the layer between like the warehouse and the application layer go like just get like significantly thinner and thinner and thinner until it's all one big thing. Which is why like warehouses are calling themselves like the like the data app ecosystem or like the data cloud rather than the data warehouse because they have a server component now too. And yeah, I think we kind of discussed this already, but it's kind of far away for us to think that everything will become a data app. So because of like the no transactions and because of no like foreign keys and so forth, like it's pretty hard to imagine that we would use data apps for everything. We can imagine using it for things like embedded analytics because it's okay if those analytics compute every hour, or for things that are like aggregations. Like I just want to see which product category is selling the most in my company, and I can see that in my data app. So for use cases like that are based on aggregations, it's pretty practical. For read-only use cases, again, it's pretty practical because the caching layer can cause fast reads. But for write use cases, it gets pretty complex. And that's where we're hoping that like more infrastructure will be developed here over time. And so until then, I think like that's kind of where reverse ETL fits in for now, where right now you use reverse ETL to get data from the data warehouse into SaaS applications because it's almost like I don't want to say sub-optimization, but it's almost like the practical way to do things because you need that data in Salesforce or Braze or Iterable. And so it's kind of like over time, we'd expect more and more analytical use cases to be data app use cases, and then more and more business use cases to be reverse ETL. And I think it's a little bit far away before this becomes a true reality. Yeah, and thanks for listening to the talk. Would love to take questions from the crowd.